A reminder, this story is fictional. She grabbed the first arm she could find and begged for help. The sound of her own voice surprised her. Small, urgent, a paper-thin thing trying to hold back something much larger. He didn't flinch. He leaned in and said, "Pretend I'm your protector." The words fell into the chaos like a steady stone. Camila felt them as a pressure behind her ribs, an invitation to stop trembling. She had been practicing for years how not to be visible, how to move a stroller quietly through crowded streets, how to smile without exposing the scarred edges of memory. But memory did not always respect practice. When she saw him, the man she recognized without wanting to, her body remembered first. Her heart hammered. Something old and sharp pushed at her throat. Sofia had settled her small face against Camila's shoulder, fingers tangled in the pendant Camila had made. The pendant was a tiny riverstone wrapped in silver, imperfect and cool. Sofia had found it that morning in a pocket and declared it lucky. Now her breath smelled of cotton candy and the fading perfume of a hotel crowd. The ballroom was awash of light and glass. Crystal chandeliers made the air seem powdered. A fundraiser, a client presentation for a trade that rarely paused for formalities. Camila had agreed to be there to show a small collection of her work. Jewelry could be heavy with story. For her, it was survival dressed as beauty. She had hoped to slip in and out, to stand by her display while Yulia, the babysitter, kept Sofia occupied with coloring books in a corner. She had not expected what had been waiting near the main entrance. He stood close to a bank of elevators, talking to someone Camila could not properly hear. He was taller than she remembered. He moved with the clean sturdiness of someone who believed in the solidity of his own life. The angle of his jaw, the scar at the edge of his brow, tiny things, but enough. He had been a shadow in Camila's past she had worked to forget, not violent in some cinematic way, quiet control, possessive. The kind of man who told truths in small, rearranging increments until the house of a life shifted into something unfamiliar. At first, Camila told herself she could manage. She tightened her hand on Sofia's stroller and thought of the marketplace where she'd set the little case of rings and a neat row of necklaces. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers like a lens. Her breath lodged in her chest, the rehearsed calm split. A woman at the next rack of dresses stared. Some of the guests smiled politely and looked away. Her own voice moved before she could stop it. "Please," she said, clutching at the suited man nearest, stumbling toward him with all the civility drained out of her features. "Help us. There's someone—" That nearest man was not a guard. He was too well dressed for security. His suit cut with a kind of ease Camila had only seen in magazines. He did not pull away when she grabbed him. He did not ask for credentials or push back. He placed his hand, clean and flat, just above her shoulder, as if to anchor both her and the child pressed against her. His voice was an even, low thing, neither patronizing nor theatrical. "Pretend I'm your protector." Camila didn't ask why. She needed something immediate and solid, somebody to give her permission to stop scanning for exits in danger. She let him guide them toward a balcony, out of the shimmer and into a line of cool air that smelled of rain and magnolia. The city thrummed beneath them, a distant bass note. The sound of their retreat made Camila feel like an animal led from a trap. On the balcony, the noise fell away. There was an empty chair, lacquered and bright. The stranger sat, as if he had always expected to, and watched Sofia with that attentive, unhurried attention that felt like uncommon currency to a woman with a small child. Sofia blinked at him, curious, and then, as if deciding him safe in the span of a second, offered him the corner of a cracker she had been chewing. "What's your name?" she asked solemnly, holding out the morsel like a treaty. "Raphael," he said, and took the cracker as if receiving a gift. He made a little face, grand, humorous, that made Sofia laugh. Camila held on to the laugh like someone cupping a fragile bird. It did not fix anything. It did not erase the past, but it made the present bearable enough to breathe. "You don't have to stay," she said, because manners sometimes steadied her when fear made other things messy. Her voice was smaller now, careful. "Thank you, really. We'll—" "Stay?" Raphael repeated, with a soft incredulity that did not mock. "If you want, yes, until you're sure or until your ride comes, however long you need." She found herself telling him, to his face, how small she allowed herself to imagine safety. She said it in fragments, how empty spaces made her think of late nights filled with the sound of doors being closed, how the hum of a room could become a map of watched exits, how the smallest sound sometimes felt like a bell tolling the end of equilibrium. She did not speak of names, she had learned not to, but she spoke of the effect, the way a past man had rewritten what it meant for her to be alone with a child. "You have every right to be guarded," Raphael said. There was no pity in him. Pity was its own weight. She had learned to shed it. He simply acknowledged, as if acknowledging would not force a solution, but might make the road less dark. No one should make you feel unsafe in your own life. The trampling head of his statement was that he could have been a stranger who vanished once the elevators chimed. He could have been a reminder that some men would take advantage of openings. But he didn't. He waited, and his waiting itself was a kind of quiet offering. It was not theatrical. It had no pretended magnanimity. It was merely steadiness. He gave her a card. It was small, heavy, and balanced between business and personal. No ostentatious emblem, no attempt to dazzle. On the back, in a handwriting that slanted slightly to the right as if in a rush to communicate kindness, he wrote his number and 3 words: "Call any time, Raphael." Camilla's thumb smoothed the ink as she folded the card into her palm. The gesture was almost intimate. He was a stranger. She told herself that and tried to mean it. Still, to have had someone say plainly, "Pretend I'm your protector," and then mean it without drama, that small solidarity altered something in her. She had been practicing vigilance for years. She had not practiced being allowed help. When the man she feared finally left the room, when his presence dissolved into the foot traffic and the light, Camila understood with a sick, precise clarity that her life would always be arranged around watching. But she also understood in that slow, foreign way that someone had lifted the pressure for a moment. Someone had given her permission to rest. That night, when she walked home with Sofia asleep against her shoulder, the city lights prettified their way into soft stars. Julia met them at the door with a tired smile and a bag of Sofia's pajamas. Camila's hands, when she set Sofia down, were steady. She hung the pendant back around her neck and imagined that the silver wire of it could restrain not only a stone, but a habit. The habit of bracing for a strike. She thought about the man in the suit all the way through dinner, and then through a late cup of coffee in the dim kitchen. She ran the card through her fingers and told herself the thought would be the end of the story. It could have been. It almost was. The next morning, a simple message buzzed on her cracked phone screen. "Are you okay? R." She read it twice before answering. The impulse, strange and electric, was to protect the calm she had, like one covers a candle on a windless night. She typed and deleted. In the end, she wrote the smallest truth. "Thank you. Sofia and I are okay." And then, because something in her wanted to see where his offer could go without the dangerous slideshow of past rulers, she added, "Coffee?" He replied almost immediately. 9 at the park? By the big fountain? Camila told Julia she was going out. She told herself she was going to meet a man she had known for all of a half hour. She told herself this like a list of facts. She put on jeans. She tucked a ribbon into Sofia's hair. She wrapped a cashmere scarf around her neck like armor. The park was the one she walked through on market days, the one where people brought books and dogs and portable breakfasts and a general lack of hurry. Raphael sat on the edge of the fountain, the water making a lazy, constant noise. He had brought a thermos of coffee and a small paper cup of something cocoa for Sofia.
He had also brought Darwin's leash looped on his wrist. A small gray cat, alert and puckish, sat in the crook of his arm and peered at the world with the serene disdain of pets used to privilege. Darwin blinked slowly and regarded the child with the comfortable hierarchy of someone who had been tolerated by children before. Sofia's first move was to crawl up onto Raphael's knee and pat Darwin like a dignitary. "What's his name?" she asked solemnly. "Darwin," Raphael said. "He chooses when to be friendly." Camila watched from the bench as boy and cat and man formed a transient concert. The simplicity of it undid something inside her. Here was a man who, in small gestures, the way he handed a cup, the way he remembered to fold his coat over an errant shoelace, showed a kind of care that was not performative. It fit into the margins of life. They talked about small things at first, the chaos of parenting a 3-year-old, the challenges of running a household alone, the ways a jeweler needed time to let a design settle in her hands. Sofia spoke of metals and wax and patient hammering. She showed him pictures on her phone of a ring she was working on, its bezel not yet set, the light playing across a curve she had only just discovered. Raphael listened as if the arc of a story mattered. When she explained how a small notch could change a necklace's mood, he smiled with those quiet, thoughtful lines at the corners of his mouth. He asked practical questions. How long until it would sell? Where did she source stones? Did she have a studio assistant? There was curiosity without condescension. He did not ask questions about her past, and the omission felt like respect rather than ignorance. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said at one point, as if reading the soft map of her boundaries. "But if there is ever anything I can do—" She had been told things like that before. Promises came in different qualities. This one arrived unadorned. It was not an oath brandished like a shield. It was more like a tool laid on a table, useful if taken, not weaponized if refused. "Thank you," she said. "I run a small atelier in Pineros. I sell mostly to boutiques and a few private clients. I work odd hours. I babysit, make jewelry, and fix things only as an ecosystem of small repairs. I don't want to be rescued. I want to be less afraid." He listened to that, really listened, and then said with a gentleness that did not flatten her into a dependent role, "I want to be someone who helps you keep the lights on more steadily, not because you can't do it, but because sometimes a person sharing the load makes it possible to create space for other things, for you, for Sofia." He spoke like a man who had experience with responsibility and with the language of business, efficiency, delegation, constant calendars. But he also spoke like someone who had sat with grief and come to respect the slow contour of steady presence. He told her, in a sentence, that he had lost his father 2 years earlier. The man had run a small firm and taught Raphael to care for people as assets of life rather than merely of work. Raphael had inherited a company and then, separately, a sense of how to keep a room steady. It did not make him immune to mistakes. It made him aware that mistakes existed. When she asked, candidly, because children were truth-tellers, "Are you rich?" he laughed softly. "Technically. It is a thing that complicates normal chores, like grocery lists end up with delivery drivers, and the small rebellions of a child are met with a similar shrug. But money doesn't solve fear. Money buys safety nets. It doesn't mend a quiet that has been broken." Sofia announced midway through, between bites of a cookie, that Raphael could sleep over. She made it official with the solemn dignity only children can possess. Camila reddened with that particular protective embarrassment parents have when strangers step into family lines. Raphael did not take advantage of the moment. He simply blinked and smiled at the girl, as if agreeing to a treaty. "Maybe not tonight," he said, "but I'd like to be someone who is around more often, if you'd let me." There was a temptation to catalog his mistakes like evidence against himself. The fact of a suit, the thick card with his name, the ease of his manners. There was another temptation, less useful, which was to imagine a life smoothed by money into a tapestry where everything fit without friction. Camila knew both temptations intimately. She also knew how fragile they were. What mattered to her was not whether he could pay for everything that fear made expensive. It was whether he could be ordinary in the right ways, to remember breakfasts, to knock rather than barge, to sit with her in silence when the nights were heavy. Over the next weeks, the guardian role Raphael had asked to enact transformed into a practice rather than a costume. They found themselves moving through days stitched together by small acts. He sent messages to check if the babysitter had arrived without being invasive. He offered once to pick up Sofia from preschool when a client had extended a meeting because the final hour of negotiating a contract was being stubborn. He arrived accompanied by Darwin, who seemed to know the rhythm of a child's life, and he handed Sofia a paper bag with a small Play-Doh set. Camila watched how the slow accumulation of ordinary presents worked like seasoning on a dish, not dramatic, rarely beautiful in a single flicker, but good enough to change the flavor of things. Raphael did not sweep in with capital and fix every problem. He fixed the small practical things that made days breathe easier. He mended a leaky faucet when a pipe under her sink began to rattle. He offered to help pick up materials when a supplier's order messed up her week. He learned the route to Sofia's preschool. He learned to carry a child while balancing a portfolio on his shoulder. He did not insist on being the hero. He insisted on being steady. When he came to the atelier, he moved among her tools with reverence. He asked about the weight of metals and the tempering of silver. He sat on an upended box and watched the small world of her work, not as a market, but as a life. Camila liked that he asked questions about composition and balance, as if he had learned to read landscapes by their edges. She let him into the fellowship of small mechanical wonders, the way a torch kissed a bezel, the patient pressure needed to set a tiny diamond so it would not wobble in future days. Sofia took to Raphael with a speed that both pleased and startled Camila. The child's approach was direct. She asked him impossible things, how do you make a heart not afraid, and accepted his answers with the readiness that children had for simple truths. Raphael did not lie. He said, "You make brave inside yourself. I can help make room for brave, but you are the one who makes it." Sofia nodded, moved on, and found a cardboard tube to turn into a telescope. It would have been easy to arrange these things in a chronology that smoothed every seam out. It would have been easy to show a montage of instant domestic bliss. But Camila's life was not an edited reel. It had ragged edges, moments when a day ran out before her patience did, times her bank account and her energy fussed with each other. She fell asleep on the studio sofa more than once, with a soldering iron still cooling on the tray. She missed a payment here and there because a client was late. She negotiated payment plans with shops that loved her designs, but did not always have the capital to match the affection. Raphael watched these things with the eyes of a man who had been trained in numbers and risk, but who also had learned that numbers were people in suits if one squinted long enough. On a Thursday evening that carried the smell of rain and the quiet of a city winding down, Raphael knocked, and, because she had given him permission to rather than because he had assumed, he stepped across the threshold with a small bag of pastries. He carried a cat carrier, with Darwin peeking out like an ambassador. Sofia ran to him, eyes alight, and dragooned him into a game about an invisible castle. They ate pizza on a tray balanced over their knees. The tomato sauce left a small streak on Camila's hand. She did not reach for a napkin immediately. Raphael noticed and did it for her without any ceremony.
It was a small, unremarkable courtesy, but these were the moments that to Camila were the most significant thing he could give, attention that performed the practical acts of life without turning them into lessons. Sometime in the middle of that evening, Raphael's phone buzzed, and he answered with the brief professional economy of someone who had meetings that could be mosaicked across the day.
He remained in the room while he spoke, though, and Camilla watched his face take on the familiar contracted look, a man negotiating a deadline, a man who would have to leave a morning he had hoped to keep small. It was the kind of split that made her think of all the couples who'd tried to wedge two calendars together and found the edges jagged. "I'm sorry," he said into the phone, and then to the room, "It's a board thing. I have to fly out tomorrow morning, back in 2 days." A practical thing, a 2-day absence that should have been neutral. Camilla felt a thin line of disappointment run under her skin. She had not known whether she could depend on anyone for long. This was not an absence that triggered fear, but it was the first small test of the rhythm Raphael had proposed. Could someone be a steady presence if work, real, complicated, grown-up work, pulled him aside at times? Could steadiness coexist with the obligations of being who he was? "Will it be fine?" she asked aloud, and voiced a question that had more to do with trust than schedules. "It will," he said, "but I'll check in every day, and if anything happens, anything at all, you call me. I mean it." His tone was not possessive, it was not a command, it was a promise in small letters. Camilla folded it into the margin of the evening. She accepted, and because she accepted, the evening kept its warm, honest shape. She did not let herself think of the long future. She let herself think of the immediate next day, the market, a client consultation, a letter of credit she was hoping would clear. She let herself believe for that tender span in the possibility that someone who had once been a stranger might come to see them as his particular responsibility, not in the cliché of saviorism, but in the unflashy household architecture of sharing chores and picking up deadlines. Raphael's presence eventually became a thread in their daily fabric. He learned Sofia's favorite variety of pancake thinness. He learned to always leave a note on the fridge if he took leftovers. He learned the small rituals that marked home, that Camilla liked her coffee black and unsweetened, that Sofia needed a story about a brave cat named Captain Darwin before sleeping. He assumed no authority. He asked permission often. When he offered to watch Sofia while Camilla took an afternoon to focus on a large commission, he did so with the practical efficiency of someone used to logistics. He did not speak of what he was doing as heroic. He referred to it as part of the day. There were other currents beneath the surface. An ex-partner had once demanded a rewrite of shared possession. Camilla had given more of her life away than she had meant to before she understood how to keep parts for herself. The memory of that made her balk the first time Raphael reached for her hand spontaneously in a crowded street. She flinched. He drew back, not offended, but respectful, and let her set the pace.
She was learning, slowly, that choosing to let someone be near was not the same as being helpless. He did not act as if he could fix fear. He learned that the language of help had to be small, precise, and constant. Sometimes he failed. He missed a recital because of a postponed conference call. He showed up late on one of Sofia's birthdays because of a flight delay. Each misstep he apologized for in ways that recognized the weight of disappointment. And he made up for the mistakes with the same low-key consistency he had brought into the balcony that first night. The first time Camila invited him to dinner at the small rental house she had managed to find in Piñeros, she felt the strange flutter that made her wonder if she could allow herself a life in layers rather than the thin survival she had perfected. She set the table with mismatched plates that had been gifts or thrift shop finds. The candles were the smoky kind that smelled faintly of evenings she had not risked having. Sofia presented him with a crayon drawing of the three of them.
Camila, Sofia, and Raphael, holding hands. The figure of Raphael had an exaggerated smile and a cat hovering near his feet. Camila's throat tightened, and she washed a dish with the steady rhythm of someone trying to keep tears practical. After dessert, Raphael sat with his hands folded, eyes watching both of them with a contentment that did not seek to claim or define. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," he said quietly, "for letting me help in the small ways that matter." Camila almost laughed at the phrasing, "help in the small ways that matter," but she didn't. She felt the truth of it settle like a patina on something new. She had been wary of big gestures, of grand promises made on stage. Small acts were what hardened into reassurance. A person who learned the grocery list and remembered to bring soy milk so that a child would not be disappointed. A person who learned to tighten a loose drawer. A person who remembered names and allergies. Raphael was not an idea. He was a set of repeated, tangible behaviors. There were also moments when she watched him alone and wondered about the life outside their triangle. The company had responsibilities he could not fold into a pocket. There were boards to report to, clients to keep, an identity he had not chosen free of its obligations. She watched his constricted face sometimes when a call came in, the slate of his features shifting into business. She knew that being chosen by somebody with that life meant that choice would be negotiated with calendars and commitments. It did not scare her off. It made the project, if she let herself see it as one, realistic. One afternoon he surprised them by arriving at the atelier with a small wrapped box. "I thought you might like to see this," he said, sliding the package onto her workbench like something sacred. Inside was a little magnifying loupe, an old-fashioned jeweler's loupe, heavy and warmed in his hands.
"It's the same kind I used when I was a kid," he said. "My father kept one on his tool bench. He was always telling me to look closer for detail. I thought you might like it." She put it to her eye, and the world exploded into tiny clarity. The grain of metal, the edge of a file, the way a solder bead sat like a frozen tear. She looked up at him through that small glass and saw him as he wanted to be, present, attentive, doing the small thing of recognizing a craft and honoring it. There was humility in bringing an object to another's practice rather than trying to remake it. "Thank you," she said. They shared a look that was not a vow, but the hint of a possibility. If there was a theme to their tentative relationship, it was this: protection without possessiveness, presence without assumption. Raphael's wealth mattered sometimes. They could pay for a repair that would have otherwise required an expensive wait, or he could cover a small clinic visit with no awkwardness. But money was not the glue. The glue was repetition, morning texts, coffee on market days, being on time for recitals, folding laundry into neat piles after long weeks. Camila had a life she could manage on its own. She let him into the corners of that life because inviting someone in did not equal surrender. It was a test of whether the person offered could live with the real, not the imagined, edges of her days. One evening, 2 months after the balcony that changed the course of their small constellation, they walked through the park and came to the fountain where they had first sat. Sofia had fallen asleep in her stroller. Julia was on her way to pick up a late client order. The city's light had thinned into a safety of lamplight. Raphael paused at the edge of the fountain and turned to her with an expression that made her muscles rearrange. "Do you remember," he asked, "the first thing I said?" She smiled, because of course she did, and because the sentence that had brought them out onto that balcony still felt like a cornerstone. "Yes, pretend I'm your protector." He laughed softly. "I thought I could start with pretending. The pretending is easier than the doing sometimes, but pretending is a way to learn how to be protective without taking over." She considered the word pretending as a tiny admission. Pretending was not deception. Pretending had been his way of stepping into a role he could grow into. He had not demanded it. He had offered it like an experiment. Try this on. See how it feels. The small daily habit of him being there had turned the costume into a fit. It had turned the lie into a beginning. "How are you learning?" she asked, because she needed to know that his intention was not a passing fancy. "Daily," he said, "by being present, by listening when you tell me no, by being careful with Sofia, by remembering things you say about your work and not assuming I know better, by apologizing when I mess up." He meant it. There was no grand speech. There never had been. He was an accumulation of acts. That was what made the possibility less frightening. She looked down at her hands. "I still have to protect myself," she said. "I won't hand that over. But I am learning that I can let someone see me in the small ways without it meaning I'm surrendering my life." He put a cautious hand over hers, gentle and patient. "And I promise I will only ever offer to help with the things you want help with. I won't decide for you." Camila let herself relax against that promise the way one relaxes into a chair that fits. There remained a flicker of unease, how could she not? But for now, the easy edges of the evening were enough. They walked home together, Sofia asleep, and for once the weight of the past not crowding the thin present. Raphael carried a little paper bag with pastries for Yulia as a token, and Darwin walked with an easy, assured gait nearby. The next morning, as they moved through their separate days, Raphael's assistant called about an early meeting moved to a different time. The voice on the phone wrote a different script than the one that had been forming in the quiet hours. He answered with the same efficiency he used when balancing calendars and hearts alike. "I'll arrange it," he said, and then, after a breath, "I can make space this weekend." Camila read his text in the library of her lunch break and felt something that was not panic, but an aware caution. The calendar, for all its usefulness, was also the place where promises sometimes frayed. She trusted him enough to let him be part of their life, but there would be testing days ahead, business trips and deadlines and inevitable absences. He had promised, with small, repeated acts, to be steady. Now, life, as it tends to do, would present the usual friction of work and family and trust. She put the phone away and tuned back into a ring of silver she was repairing. The metal glowed at the edge of the torch. She folded over a piece of wire with practiced fingers. The world kept making opportunities to be ordinary, and the ordinary was exactly where she wanted to live. If the ordinary was where she wanted to live, then the next months rearranged themselves politely around that preference. Days threaded into one another like beads on a string, some chipped, some bright, and Camila learned that a life built slowly could still surprise with its steadiness. If you enjoy character-driven romantic stories like this, leave a like and subscribe for more. Work-filled mornings. Clients came by the atelier with soft requests, making room for Camila's patient craft. Raphael fitted into afternoons and small hours, an email in the morning, a delivery in the afternoon, a presence that learned the cadence of her days rather than imposing a new one. He kept his promises in ways that required no announcement. He coordinated a supplier's rush order when a stone shipment went missing, then refused to let the gesture become a cautionary statement about his wealth. He did the small practical things and left the big decisions to be shaped by conversation. The move-in talk began one evening over a batch of pancakes that Raphael had learned to make to Sofia's exacting standards, edges just crispy, center soft. Sofia declared mid-bite that she wanted Raphael to sleep in the blue room because Darwin liked it. Camila saw Raphael's light laugh settle into something warmed by habit, and she surprised herself by saying the thing she'd been turning in her hands for a week. "I think we should try living together," she said. Raphael paused with a fork suspended and looked at her as if cataloging not just the words, but the small rests between them. "Only if you want," he said, "and only if you say yes like choosing something, like a ring band you want to keep." She almost laughed at that, how jewelry kept changing metaphors around her, but his soft, practical analogy steadied the edges of her anxiety. "I want to, but I want rules," she said, the way someone reads a contract aloud, because practical things made her trust easier. "Name them," he said. She spoke carefully, Lists for mornings, everyone was responsible for their laundry. Raphael would not rearrange the studio or call his contractor to change the apartment's structure without asking. He would not suggest legal or financial changes they had not agreed to. He wanted her to know that procedural things could feel like power, and that power for her was private and needed to be preserved. He agreed, and they wrote a small list, half serious, half joking, and pinned it above the refrigerator like a pronouncement. We will consult for big changes. We will not use money to make apologies. We will use a whiteboard for shared errands. Camila felt silly and relieved. The small page became a promise of procedure, mundane but binding. Packing was less dramatic than she imagined. Julia moved boxes with the practiced steadiness of someone who had watched Camila build a life out of tiny, precious things. Marina came on moving day with 2 thermoses and a knowing grin, playing the practical friend who supplied both muscle and elbow room. Bruno did the heavy lifting, complaining gently about how Raphael's boxes came in clear, uniform shapes, while Camila's were a collage of old shoeboxes and cake tins. Darwin adjusted in a way that made everyone laugh. He found a square of sunlight on the new living room floor and assumed domain. The first night in the apartment had a softness that was almost indecent. It was only their first bed shared, a small ritual that felt both ordinary and radical to Camila.
Sofia slept with a hand tucked into the crook of Camila's elbow. Raphael left a note on the bedside table that read, "I will leave before you wake if you prefer," in the same slanted hand that had written his number on the balcony card weeks ago. She read it and slipped the paper under her pillow like a talisman. There were awkward things. Raphael discovered the exact number of coffees she drank and attempted to reduce the stash. Shoes were left in the wrong place by either party, and once he scolded an oven to the point of a mildly comedic argument when he had misread a recipe. But his default was to ask, to apologize when his assumptions landed awkwardly, and to learn. One of the first real tests came with work. A big client of Raphael's, the sort of corporate account that could swallow a weekend, required his presence in another city for an extended negotiation. He left with a soft insistence. "I will be attentive from a distance. I will call every night." He said it like a vow, and as before, his follow-through was measured. He called, he texted, he left messages that were more about care than control. The nights he was gone, Camila let the empty space be what it was instead of making it into a metaphor for abandonment. She wrote late into the night, filed receipts, and soldered under the lamp until the point of muscle memory blurred into dreams. The first sharp argument was a winter thing, thin with rain and the weight of schedules. Raphael had taken it upon himself to organize a major repair in her studio during a week when a large commission was due. He had spoken with a contractor he trusted and scheduled the work to happen while she was at a midday meeting, thinking to spare her the inconvenience. Camila found out when she came home to see a whiteboard covered in diagrams of shelving and a man loudly declaring where a table should be. It felt to her like an invasion, the old language of control returning in a new suit. She felt the cold familiarity of being overridden, of decentered choices. Her voice rose, not because of opulence, but because of the memory it tugged at. "Why would you do that without asking me?" she asked. The words were sharp but honest. "This is my workspace." Raphael looked taken off guard, mortified in a way that was almost endearing. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I thought I was taking a load off. I didn't mean to decide for you." "That's the thing," Camila pressed her hands to her temples. "That help used to be the language of control for me. When someone helps by deciding, they erase what you already know about your life. I can't—" Her voice broke for a second and she took a breath. The break was not dramatic but clean. "I can't let that happen again." He reached out, then retracted his hand, as he learned to do when she held the edges of her own space very carefully.
"I am sorry," he said without excess, and for a beat there was an honest, hungering vulnerability on his face, someone who wanted to bridge but had not yet learned the right plank. "I am trying. I did it because I thought it would ease you. I see now that it stripped you of something, and I am sorry." Long silences were sometimes more telling than explanations.
Camila walked through the studio and touched corners as if reading them anew. The table where she soldered, the drawer with tiny burrs that had the smell of metal and night lamps, the bench with a nick where she had once mis-soldered a bezel and had taught herself to laugh instead of curse. These were not just tools, they were the scaffolding of a life she had built with her hands. They sat down with humbleness and lists. They wrote a new set of rules, this time more particular. Raphael would never organize work in her studio without a joint plan. He would be the one to handle logistics like contracting, but only after her approval. If a choice needed to be made suddenly, he would call and wait. She insisted on a clause that felt both tender and necessary. He would not use money as a substitute for missing presents. He offered a counter. He would learn her suppliers' names and learn to speak to them on her behalf if she wanted, and he would hire a studio assistant to handle last-minute physical tasks when she needed hands. His suggestion carried the careful tone of a man who wanted to be helpful without taking over. It was not a grand rescue, it was work-sharing. She accepted because it fit into the architecture of their agreement. That night, as he left for an early flight he had to take, he pressed his forehead against her temple and whispered, "I am learning the long way, if you'll let me. Not to fix what was broken, but to be the sort of presence that is steady enough for you to take a risk sometimes." "Don't rebuild for me," she said. "Just be a part of what I choose to rebuild." "Always," he said. Time thinned into a pattern of tests and reconciliations. Sometimes Raphael's schedule drew a hard line, a last-minute board meeting, an emergency call, and Camila felt the strain. Other times she felt surprised by his capacity to pivot. He rearranged a flight to make it to a recital he had already said he could not attend, and he arrived in a fluster of apologies and a floral smudge of confetti from Sofia's cupcakes. He learned to tell her the truth before she had to wonder. The truth, Camila found, was more useful than silence. Their life broadened into other people's circles. Marina hosted an improvised housewarming with a battered playlist and a pitcher of sangria. Yulia brought over a casserole and stayed late to gossip about Sofia's pronunciation of architect. Raphael's world came in politely, a colleague needing a birthday present that he couldn't quite choose, a work acquaintance who complimented Camila's handmade necklace and asked questions more curious than clinical. He did not, by design or caprice, become omnipresent. He had flaws, they were visible, and they mattered. Once he misinterpreted Camila's abrupt reserve as rejection and retreated into himself for a few chilled days, the kind of withdrawal that made her wonder if the person could be counted on. He came back with apologies, with explanations that were not excuses. Grief over a contract gone sideways, difficulty reconciling personal shortcomings with the expectations of public roles. He let her see himself not as a flawless shelter, but as a man who could misstep and then take instruction. That, perhaps more than any reparative action, taught her how to measure him. Months folded into a year. They made ordinary rituals sacred. Sunday pancakes, market mornings where Raphael learned to pick exactly the amount of basil she wanted, evenings when Sofia organized a parade of stuffed animals and Raphael adjudicated with playful fairness. Darwin found a place in the ritual. He was part navigator, part listener. The cat's indifferent aristocratic disinterest softened in the presence of a child who offered steady treats. The day Raphael proposed was not a gala. It was quiet and exacting, planned inside the ordinary. They walked back to the fountain where they had sat that first week with coffee and Darwin on a leash. The water had a slow grace. Pigeons argued over the crumbs of feeding birds. A woman with a violin played a song that sounded like an old postcard. Raphael had the ring carefully wrapped in tissue paper, not dramatic but mindful. He had commissioned a setting that used one of Camila's own sketches, a small, delicate band that mirrored the riverstone pendant she wore, a copper twist that would have made her think of her workbench and the patient pressure of shaping metal. He had asked a jeweler she admired to make the hooding prongs gentle, not too classic, not too avant-garde. It was a ring that felt like a translation of her design sensibility. He knelt on one knee,
a small gesture that felt imperfect and perfectly adequate. "1 year ago, you asked me to pretend. I don't want to pretend anymore," he said. "I want to be someone who chooses you every day. Will you marry me?" The word marry landed somewhere between a question and an offering. For a long beat, Camila saw the memory of the man who had once sought to define her. She felt the reflex to guard. Then she looked at Raphael, the man who had learned patience, who had cleaned a clogged sink at midnight, who had sat through rehearsals and forgotten flights, and tried, even when he failed, to learn. She saw Sofia watching, earnest, and Darwin blinking like a small, unimpressed judge. "Yes," she said, and the single syllable felt like a folding of hands. Sofia leaped and clapped, traumatizing 2 pigeons into flight.
Marina popped out from behind a lamppost to cheer like an aunt with public approval, and Bruno took a picture that would later appear in a slideshow at the tiny backyard wedding. The proposal was not the end. It was a pivot. Planning the wedding pulled a new set of negotiations to the surface: who to invite, whether to include certain family members, how to honor the quiet that mattered. They decided on a small ceremony in Camila's backyard, the same space where Sofia had once set up a cardboard kingdom. They wanted to keep it intimate, a circle that paid attention to the meaningful things rather than the spectacle. Marina became both a bridesmaid and an organizer, and Julia did the rounds with trays, making sure the food had the kind of home-cooked warmth that stitched people close. The wedding morning smelled of jasmine and coffee. Camila found herself calmer than she expected, not theatrical calm, but a deep, practical equanimity. She slid her hands into a simple dress she had made, the hem barely touching the ground, so she could run if necessary. Sofia wore a tiny suit borrowed from a cousin. Darwin had a ribbon that made him indignant but also oddly regal. Raphael stood at the end of the aisle, an aisle made of crates and white fabric, and his suit was less a uniform than an attempt to be presentable for something that mattered. He smiled the way someone does when they are ready to be counted upon. They exchanged vows that were short and spare, the sort that enabled truth rather than theatrics. He promised to choose them. She promised to keep the lines clear. They laughed when the officiant asked if anyone objected, and only a neighbor called across the fence asking if there would be cake. Sofia, in her childish solemnity, placed the ring, slipped with a small wobble, onto Camila's finger, and declared with perfect jurisdiction that now we are family forever. The phrase was unbidden, rich, and irrevocable. They had a small reception, a table strewn with Camila's earrings as centerpieces, plates that belonged to friends, and a playlist that mixed Marina's terrible pop choices with some older, sentimental songs. It was messy and perfect. A child tripped, and no one made a scene, because someone always had a Band-Aid and another always had a joke. After the ceremony, life continued with its practical rhythms. They moved into a house they chose together, a modest place with a backyard that let sunlight in the afternoon and a small tree that would someday keep company with tire swings. They painted walls together, argued sweetly about a backsplash, and learned to coordinate calendars in a shared app that Camila resisted at first but later found useful. The house slowly bore their marks: a shelf for Sofia's drawings, a peg for Darwin's leash, a row of hooks for damp scarves. One morning, a tenderness of surprise settled over them. Camila noticed she was tired in a way caffeine did not fix.
Aware of her body's quiet messages, she took a test with the same private curiosity she brought to choosing a stone. The little window lit up, positive. Her hands trembled with a mixture of joy and an immediate practical caution. A new human meant shifts, schedules, practicalities. Raphael sat on the bathroom floor with her and laughed and cried with the raw happiness of someone who had wanted this with carefulness and had been given it. They did not shout from rooftops.
They told Julia first, then Marina, in a careful sequence that matched their life. Intimate, deliberate, shared. Sofia took to the idea with childish interpretation. She declared that the baby would like dinosaurs and would probably enjoy macaroni. She kissed Camila's belly as if testing its smoothness. Pregnancy changed the day-to-day the way a soft wind changes a curtain. Nothing violent, all rearrangement. They negotiated roles fairly. Raphael took over some of the night routine for Sofia to allow Camila to nap. He learned how to make the special pancakes gentler for mornings when she was sick, and he learned to carry a bag of groceries with both hands while Darwin wrapped himself around his ankles like an affectionate problem. There were moments of fear. The old reflex of guarding returned in whispers. What if something went wrong? And there were moments of financial reconfiguration. Camila's workload waned as she scheduled less strenuous commissions, and Raphael insisted on shifting some responsibilities. This time, the negotiation felt fair. They had set a precedent of conversation earlier, and now they were in the rhythm of it. He arranged flexible support, hiring an assistant for the atelier, converting a small shed into storage, and making sure that the medical appointments were scheduled without implying that he could fix uncertainty. In the quiet hours, when the house settled and Sofia had been tucked away with a story about Captain Darwin, the three of them, Camila, Raphael, and the cat, sat close on the sofa. He would put his hand on her belly and speak softly, in a way that matched the careful promises he'd made before. "I can't keep the world from happening," he said one November evening, "but I can try to make this corner of it safe." "You've been doing that," she said, pressing his fingers to the curve like an archivist, "not by forcing solutions, by showing up." He smiled the small smile that had become his when small, meaningful things were at stake. "It's easier to be consistent than to be heroic, and I'm choosing the consistent thing." Time took them further. They celebrated small anniversaries, the date of the balcony, the date of the fountain, the date he had first pushed open the studio door with a loop tucked into his pocket. Each marker was a stitch. They ran their fingers over the seam line and felt it hold. They ticked off a year, and then a little more, and with each notch the fear of past patterns ebbed like high tide, giving ground to everyday sand. Sofia adjusted to the notion of a sibling. She practiced being a helper, small concrete contributions like bringing a chosen stuffed animal to doctor visits and making mock lists of baby names. She was thrilled by the idea of teaching the child how to make forts. She dreamed of competitions in which Darwin would act as judge. They had days where the old guard of fear rose again, a stare in a market from someone who reminded Camila of a face in a memory, a sudden schedule clash that left Raphael unavailable for an overnight. In those times she called a friend, or she sat with Sofia, or she asked him to text what his flight schedule would be. They used the tools they had forged, gloves of honesty, lists nailed to the fridge, a whiteboard of commitments. Those small implements kept them from falling into the traps of anxiety. The final knot in their thread happened not as a crisis, but as a culmination. On a warm spring evening, as the sun was drawing out the gold in the tree outside their home, Raphael asked if they could have a day where he did nothing but be present. No calls, no meetings. He had turned all notifications off and arranged for a deputy to handle urgent issues. The day unfolded like an offered island. Breakfast on the balcony, painting together, a nap shared on the couch, an argument over the placement of a curtain that ended in laughter. That night he took out a small notebook, the kind with squared paper, and wrote something that felt like a ritual. He read it aloud, the way he had a year before, now older in small, weathered ways. "Camila," he said, "I have learned what I don't want to be, the person who decides for you without asking. I have learned what I want to be, the person who remembers to check if you need help, who will apologize when he messes up, who will reapportion time to be present. I choose you, and I choose Sofia, and I choose this life we are making, and I'll choose it again tomorrow." She felt a warmth like the nervous heat of solder meeting metal.
She let herself be held. Before answers were needed, she reached for his hand, and with quiet exactness said, "I choose you too." The months after brought the baby's arrival, a night that was long but not tragic, full of precise, focused action and the competent chaos of birth rooms and midwives. Sofia stayed 2 doors down with Julia, who reported back with giddy detail about the child's he or she debates. Darwin kept vigil by the door. When they came home with the baby swaddled and the car seat installed with a level of care and ceremony that made Camila laugh, the house felt fuller in the best sense. They adapted. Nights were difficult, mornings were thin with sleep, payments needed organizing, diapers seemed to multiply like a conspiracy. Raphael learned the rhythm of feeding schedules, not as a boardroom metric, but as a form of devotion. He rose at odd hours, not because his phone told him to, but because he had promised to be present in ways that mattered. Camila adjusted her bench, cutting back commissions and accepting that a different kind of creativity would be required now. Lullabies, tiny bracelets, a softer touch. The child, who late one night was named after the river of stones in Camila's pendant, grew with the calm insistence of small hands. Sofia proved to be a generous sister, often composing dramatic segments of pretend narratives where the baby was a brave explorer and Darwin played the role of reluctant captain. The house fell into a new rhythm where morning pancakes occurred around a wobbling high chair and the cat was often found in a precarious pile of laundry. Raphael remained a man of obligations and imperfections. He continued to have meetings that required a gentle rearrangement of domestic schedules. He continued to apologize when he failed to meet an expectation and to learn how to make amends by doing the small, often invisible things that knotted trust more tightly than speeches. He kept his promise, not as a single heroic moment, but as a steady series of acts. Once, years later, when Sofia had learned to tie her shoes and the baby was old enough to make a small tower of blocks, Camila walked through her studio and found a tiny loop hanging on a peg with a string. Raphael had left it there, a reminder of the day he had brought her his father's loop. She smiled and picked up the piece of paper he had tacked beside the peg. It read, "Pretend is no longer enough. I choose reality. A small life with real work to do, with real apologies and real breakfasts. I will be your protector, not by buying a fortress, but by being a person who is present, accountable, and humble about his mistakes." She touched the paper with the same reverence she had once reserved for silver and stone. The line that had first offered her a doorway, "Pretend I'm your protector," was no longer a prompt, but a history. It had begun as a small, compassionate experiment, a stranger offering a role to try on in a moment of panic. It had become a lived pattern of choosing to be present, choosing not to take over, choosing to learn how to stand guard without extinguishing another's light. On an ordinary afternoon, with sunlight making the kitchen tiles look like polished coins and the children's laughter a happy repeating loop, Camila sat at the table and looped a thin wire around a tiny stone. Raphael walked in and handed her a cup of coffee exactly the way she liked it. He kissed her temple, then crouched to tangle fingers with both children's small hands. Darwin wound between his ankles and was scooped into an arm. The quiet was not vacant. It was full of the sound of things being done. "I used to be very afraid," she said, voice soft but clear.
"I thought protection meant someone taking over. You taught me that protection can also be the choice to sit nearby and carry things with me, to remind me when I forget, to be the steady hand when the night gets long." He kissed her on the forehead. "You taught me how to ask for permission to help." Sofia announced to no one in particular that the baby had built a spaceship out of blocks and that Darwin had been captain for at least 5 minutes. The children argued over the proper names of invisible planets. They were noisy, they were ordinary, they were enough.
Camila looked at Raphael, and with the easy seriousness that had become their shorthand, said, "Do you remember how it started?" Raphael nodded, a small laugh in his throat. "Someone grabbed my arm at a hotel, and I said the stupid thing, 'Pretend I'm your protector.'" She smiled at the memory, the immediacy of it, the way a single line, spoken in a flash of clarity, had unmoored a sequence of events that made a life. "You didn't have to pretend for long," she said, "but I liked that you gave me the option." He reached for her hand and squeezed. "I never pretended afterward," he said. "I chose." They sat like that for a while, hands linked, the domestic sounds steady, the cat asleep in a patch of sunlight like a heartbeat. Outside, the neighborhood continued. People came and went, cars hummed, an old woman walked her dog. Nothing dramatic interrupted the scene. The world offered its usual hum and the small rebellions of weather and mail and children. When the day waned and the family's shadows lengthened across the tiles, Camila felt a peace that was a practiced thing. It wasn't the absence of fear, that would be naive, but a confidence in how to manage it, to name it, to call for help, to rely on small rituals and the fellow labor of others. It was the kind of peace that grew out of ordinary repetition, breakfasts remembered, apologies made and accepted, promises kept in daily acts. She thought of the man at the hotel, how she had grabbed his arm in panic, and how a sentence, "Pretend I'm your protector," had been the hinge between two lives. She thought how he had offered the role like a question, and how the answer had become different from anything he or she first imagined. It wasn't a single rescue. It was a life made together. The kitchen clock ticked the afternoon toward evening. The children bickered over a cup. Darwin stretched and yawned, releasing a small plume of fluff. Raphael kissed Camila again, gentler this time, as if to seal the day's small promises. "We're good," he said. "We're good," she agreed. They kept living like that, chosen, choosing, steady in the ways that mattered. The phrase that once sounded like a line from a play had become a lived truth. He had asked her to pretend once, and that allowed both of them to learn what protection could be, an active, mutual practice of presence, consent, and humility. It kept them human, and it kept them together.